The Taliban completed their sweep of the country's south on Friday. The militant group has taken 4 more provincial capitals in a lightning offensive that has brought them closer to the capital, Kabul. In just the last 24 hours, the country's second and third largest cities, Herat in the west and Kandahar in the south, have fallen to the insurgents, as has the capital of the southern province of Helmand, where American, British and NATO forces fought some of the bloodiest battles of the conflict. But to discuss the unfolding events in Afghanistan, we are now joined by Mabrur Ahmed from the UK-based non-profitable, non-political, international grassroots human rights charity group, Restless Beings in London. Mabrur, a very good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the Globe.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Does the fall of Mazar-e-Sharif, the country's 4th largest city, which Afghan forces and 2 powerful former warlords have pledged to defend, does it essentially hand over Taliban, or rather hand the Taliban control over all of northern Afghanistan?
I mean, it's not just northern Afghanistan. I think the Taliban basically, apart from the very, very central region around Kabul, are in charge of Afghanistan now. They are in control of almost 80% of Afghani territory now. It's just a matter of time before Kabul falls. And I think what's interesting and what's noteworthy is the sounds that the Afghan Prime Minister and presidents have basically made in the last sort of 24 hours. Which do not sound anything near convincing for the Afghani people that there may be some way other than the Taliban as their future.
And we've seen President Ashraf Ghani saying that, and I'm going to quote him verbatim, he says, "As your president, my focus is on preventing further instability, violence and displacement of my people," he said in a televised address. So does that mean that the government has really fallen to the Taliban?
I think in essence it has. There isn't any negotiation going on at the moment. I think the Taliban had tried to make the sounds that if the leadership was to resign, then Kabul would be taken in a non-combat method and negotiations would begin. But that's not about to happen. I think from what we're hearing in Kabul, the live address also mentioned about a reorganization of the military, and I can't understand how a reorganization of the military, which is obviously severely weakened with the withdrawal of foreign troops and foreign investment and training, etc., but how that's going to in any way stop what seems to be the absolute inevitability of Afghanistan in Taliban hands.
Now, Mabrur, let's take it back a bit, if we can, to how the genesis of this conflict started. So who are the key leaders in Afghanistan, and how do they manage to, how did the Taliban manage to advance so rapidly across Afghanistan? Like, what gave them the impetus to do so?
So I think what we need to understand is the political and geographical landscape of Afghanistan is such that although there is a central government and under the guide and leadership of a president and prime minister, essentially there are territories and zones within the country which have their own kind of tribal leadership and tribal organization as well. Much like how any federal state actually, manages its sovereignty. Not too dissimilar to that. And so what the Taliban have done, and in essence what the occupiers of America and the West did when they took Afghanistan from the Taliban, is basically go by region, and proxy wars in each of those regions. Of course, with Kabul being the capital city and the main kind of administrative center of the country. And so that's how the leadership is either enabled or dismantled, and that's exactly the same as what we've seen now, which is all the territories basically encircling Kabul have essentially fallen to the Taliban hands, away from government hands, and like I said, it's not too dissimilar how the US and others invaded and took the territory of Afghanistan away from the Taliban in the first place in the early 2000s, and that's the return of that is what we're seeing right now. The converse of that is what we're seeing right now.
Would I be too ambitious to opine that there is now a leadership void, as the citizens of Afghanistan themselves, are decrying the fact that they were sold out? They just cannot understand why there was no government resistance on the part of the government.
So So I think there's a few things to untangle here. Firstly, it was quite apparent that Afghanistan was had plateaued into a political stalemate, in the sense that there were many areas which were controlled by the Taliban, yes, through force, majority, and that at some point there needed to be some sort of discussions and negotiations and power sharing debates that needed to be had within the national within the national debate. But the US, as, if you like, the protectorate of the Afghan government and state, decided to withdraw all their military, and with that, it was, what I'm trying to say is that it was a military decision to withdraw, the US to withdraw, and with that there was a very big missed opportunity, which was to have some sort of political conciliation talks, which probably would have handed the country over, when the US had left, into hands which were probably more stable. But the withdrawal was purely on a military basis, so it was an immediate withdrawal in effect. And with no political resolution. And I think that's what's played out now, which is the Taliban in its very primitive form, in terms of political diplomacy, suggested that if Kabul was to fall, or if the president and the prime minister were to resign, then in that case there wouldn't be any further bloodshed within Kabul. But that didn't mean that the rest of the country was going to follow in the same fate. And obviously we've already seen that. Hundreds have been killed, and there have been thousands, potentially even reaching into the millions, who have been displaced, internally displaced, or made into kind of internal refugees, who have all now gone into Kabul. And within the next 24 to 96 hours, I think it's quite safe to say that Kabul will fall, either, violently through the Taliban, or if the government decides that they are going to listen and negotiate on the table, potentially somewhat more peacefully. But without doubt, the misery and the destruction is on the people and the civilians of Afghanistan, far more than it will ever be on government figures and within the government elite and within the Taliban themselves.
So from your observation, has it been a long time coming? Was this part of a well-hatched plan, to occupy Afghanistan, or was it simply in response to the US withdrawing its troops?
Listen, I think when we're talking about occupation, the first thing that we need to understand is that the existing occupation, when they decided to leave, the US is to who I'm referring, left without any political resolution. And so the moment that there was no political resolution, it paved the way for the Taliban through force or through diplomacy, which we know that they're not capable of, to retake or to take away Afghanistan from very weak political leadership. And that's exactly what we've seen. I don't know if it's necessarily that the US's policy was to leave Afghanistan in disarray. I think what they realized was that there was going to be casualties, there was going to be a charge by the Taliban, and decided to get their men out of harm's way, but have done so rather clumsily, in the sense that there's no political resolution. And this is the reason we've seen such fierce fighting, rapid falling of towns and capitals of provincial areas. And like I said, the most severely affected are the civilians.
So will this perhaps inspire a change of heart from Washington in terms of, in terms of amending the foreign policy with regards to Afghanistan, and to see a redeployment of troops to Afghanistan?
I think if you listen to all of the sound bites coming out of all of the governments, the British government, the US government, and other European governments who have, kind of intelligence teams and security teams in the area, it's all about rapid withdrawal right now. And it all strikes of the same tone, which is washing their hands of any foreign policy in Afghanistan, which is very strange when, for the best part of the last generation, that's been their primary foreign policy and the way of protecting their own security in their own country, seeing that they recognized Afghanistan to be one of the hubs of international terror. What's been failed amongst all of this, like I said, and for the third time, are the people, because what the withdrawal, what the West's withdrawal has meant to the people of Afghanistan is an immeasurable wave of consistent terror in their own lands, which is apparently what the West's occupation was to eradicate in the first place. So a generation later, 20 years later, for that to have not happened, and to have for the people to go through that traumatic experience is nothing short of absolute failure in foreign policy in Afghanistan, and an absolute washing of hands of a continuation of foreign policy in Afghanistan.
It does appear, Mabrur, that Afghanistan is now incredibly isolated with regards to the intervention from the international community, with the United States still not clear whether there will be starting a redeployment process of some of its troops to Afghanistan. And Canada, on the other hand, saying that special forces formed part of a contingency plan to airlift embassy staff out of Kabul. And on the other hand, Britain saying that they will be deploying 600 troops, but only to support British leaving in Afghanistan. So in terms of a full-scale intervention, are we likely to see it coming from the international community?
Well, I think, as you've alluded to in your question, the evacuation plans or the redeployment of personnel is for evacuation. It's not to maintain peace within the country. Okay. It's not to broker peace, but it's solely to evacuate their own people. And even the caveat of, we will try to get out people who have helped security forces, who have given intelligence previously, is merely words, because the Taliban are of course they will target government officials, of course they will target foreign individuals and those who have assisted the foreign embassies and intelligence services, but they will target everyone because they're looking to take entire territory and the entire country. So everyone is included in that. Just because someone is a foreign national or someone has helped a foreign government does not mean that their blood is more weightier than those who are rural people or who are normal city dwellers in and around many cities and towns across Afghanistan. Again, I think the policy of trying to word it such that there is a redeployment when really it's just an evacuation plan is misleading, and I think it creates this false sense of trying to negotiate peace. There is no negotiation of peace. It's only a withdrawal of their own people.
Are you privy to the Taliban's long-term plan in terms of taking over Afghanistan? Is it only a temporary measure to sort of, weigh in on some of the issues that they're trying to put across, or is it part of a long-term plan to finally take over Afghanistan?
I think when you look at a country like Afghanistan and its history, and you see that the toing and froing of powership and leadership struggles going from one to another, with foreign forces coming into play and using it as a proxy war for something which is far larger, an element like the Taliban cannot be trusted to govern in the way that we expect governance to take place. And I think that also is quite important, that Afghanistan has never really been governed in the way that we expect a country to be governed here in the West, in the US or in the UK or in the EU or in other parts of the world. They have their own way of leadership, and it's a violent way of leadership, the Taliban's. But Afghanistan itself, as with many other countries in the region, in that particular region, have a lot of tribal leadership and a lot of kind of brokering and negotiating within regions. That's not about to happen in Afghanistan right now. I don't think the Taliban are coming here to act as temporary guardians, to only then to hand over peace to the newly elected government. I don't think that's what's going to happen. It seems that they are sweeping for power and for a permanence of power.
And having said that, Mabrur, I'm actually glad you made that point, but is it too early now to start negotiations around whether the government needs to hand over power to a transitional authority, one that has the credibility to negotiate on behalf of the anti-Taliban camp?
Look, I think here's the key thing, and this is the policy that we've seen in many other parts of the world. The Taliban are quite clearly a force in Afghanistan. So to completely ignore them from the political dialogue for the past 20 years was probably a mistake, because they retain some level of power. Whether it's violent or whether it's acceptable to us is besides the point. They do retain power. They are a shareholder. They are a stakeholder of power within the country, and they should have been brought to the table far earlier on. Yes, admittedly, we cannot let a country fall under the hands of a leadership which is going to be, marginalizing large parts of society. But considering that they already have political influence, to ignore them was the wrong decision. Therefore, by doing that time and time again for the past 20 years and beyond, what's happened is the policy of the Taliban has grown more and more intense. It gives more and more credibility to their calls of foreign occupiers being moved from their land, etc., etc. And unfortunately, that leads to better recruitment, more training, more investment into this kind of governance and policy of terror. And that's what we've seen now. If any intervention was to happen right now, the Taliban need to be brought to the table. Like I said, I'm not advocating for the Taliban to be in any leadership in Afghanistan, but they cannot simply just be ignored, as we've seen in many other parts of the world, especially in the Middle East, where those who are ignored, all we do is give their people and their supporters more credibility to ignite and to continue the violence which they think is legitimate.
Now, Mabrur, just taking into cognizance the history of antagonisms between the government and the Taliban, is there perhaps a possibility or a likelihood that the Taliban and the government of Afghanistan could enter into meaningful engagement and negotiations to find a lasting peace solution? And just considering the fact that the Taliban has asked President Ghani to step down, is it likely to do so?
I don't think President Ghani is likely to step down anytime soon. It is my absolute hope that there is going to be some sort of discussion. Let's not say it's going to be the most meaningful brokerage in the world, but even if there is some discussion at this stage, anything that can delay or can eradicate the risk to humanitarian crises must be worth exploring. And I think the idea that Ghani, with this in mind, may enter into discussions with the Taliban is perhaps the only hope to kind of evade any further bloodshed. Is it likely to happen? Unfortunately, having spent 15 years as an activist and many more studying the history of the world, this is not likely to happen. It's unlikely that there will be any peace negotiations. It's more likely that the Taliban, by this time next week, will probably be in full control of Kabul and therefore Afghanistan.
Mabrur, it's been lovely chatting to you. Thank you so much for your analysis on this matter.
Thank you.